that we can actually see it happening. And I give some examples of that, some lizards and Mediterranean islands which were transported experimentally in, I think, the 1950s, and then just simply left for a few decades. And then researchers went back a few decades later and looked at the lizards, how they'd spread through the island, and found how they had changed in a matter of a couple of decades to fit the changed conditions of the new island. I give other examples as studies of guppies, and in particular, a brilliant study by Richard Lenski at Michigan State University of bacteria. Bacteria having a life cycle that lasts about half an hour. That obviously has great advantages for studying evolution in a human lifespan. Chapter 6, missing link. What do you mean missing? Creationists love gaps in the fossil record. They think gaps in the fossil record are meat and drink to them. Needless to say, we're lucky to have any fossils at all. I mean, if we didn't have fossils, the evidence for evolution would still be absolutely overwhelming. Nevertheless, fossils are extremely nice evidence for the details of how evolution has happened, and as you would expect, there isn't a fossil for every single stage in every single evolutionary progression. There are gaps, but the gaps, of course, do not mean that they have to be filled by a postulation of a creative intelligence. I use the analogy of a detective coming on the scene of a crime after it's taken place. We scientists are in the position of detectives who come on the scene of a murder. We can't see the murder, we can't witness the murder, and by the same token we can't witness evolution happening, usually. But we can see the clues that are all around, the footprints, the fingerprints, the bloodstains, all the things that the detective can look at, the scientist can look at. Fossils are part of it, there are other parts of it as well, but fossils are particularly persuasive. And like the material that is available to a detective investigating a murder, there isn't an absolutely detailed record of everything that happened. You've got fragments of evidence here, fragments of evidence there, and that's what fossils are like. Chapter 7 moves on to human evolution, missing persons, missing no longer, and discusses in some detail evidence that was not available to Darwin. There were virtually no human fossils in Darwin's time. Darwin presciently conjectured that because of the affinities between humans and chimpanzees and gorillas, the best place to look for human fossils would be Africa. And that was the guess at the time, but so it has proved. And we now have fossils in abundance from Africa of human evolution. Humans are closer cousins to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are cousins to gorillas. And humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas are all closer cousins of each other than any of them is to orangutans. So we are not just like apes, we're not just descended from apes, we are apes. We are African apes, and we are very close relatives of chimpanzees. Slightly less close relatives of gorillas, as are chimpanzees. Chapter 8 is about embryology. It's called You Did It Yourself in 9 Months. I'll just read you a little bit to show where that comes from. It's quite a nice quotation. This is from the beginning of chapter 8. That irascible genius, J.B.S. Haldane, who did so much else besides being one of the 3 leading architects of neo-Darwinism, was once challenged by a lady after a public lecture. It's a word-of-mouth anecdote, and John Maynard Smith is sadly not available to confirm the exact words. But this is approximately how the exchange went. Evolution skeptic. Professor Haldane, even given the millions of years that you say were available for evolution, I simply cannot believe it is possible to go from a single cell to a complicated human body with its trillions of cells organized into bones and muscles and nerves, a heart that pumps without ceasing for decades, miles and miles of blood vessels and kidney tubules, and a brain capable of thinking and talking and feeling. JBS Haldane. But madam, you did it yourself, and it only took you 9 months. Chapter 9, The Arc of the Continents. This is one of the most persuasive pieces of evidence that Darwin himself was very keen on. The distribution, the geographical distribution of animals and plants over the globe. And Australia is a particularly good place to talk about this because the mammal fauna of Australia is, of course, unique and fascinating and a perfect example of evidence for evolution. It couldn't be better if it had been stage managed to provide evidence for evolution. You have this entire caste of mammals which are evolutionarily quite distinct from the mammals in most of the rest of the world, marsupials quite distinct, and yet the marsupials have radiated and produced a range of creatures which closely parallel the same range of creatures that the other groups of mammals, the other kinds of mammals, have produced in the Old World. And by the way, South America, which was an island for much of the same period, South America provides another glorious natural experiment. There used to be lots of marsupials in South America, just as there are in Australia. Most of those are now extinct, unfortunately. I do a little bit of... How much time? You're very kind. I was told how friendly Australians are, and indeed. Yes, right. Okay. Okay. Well, that was the chapter called "The Arc of the Continents," and it ends up by talking about plate tectonics and continental drift, as it used to be called. Australia was, of course, part of the great southern continent of Gondwana. And that's a fascinating story in its own right. That's a 20th century story, that the idea that the continents used to be in radically different places is an utterly strange idea. When I was an undergraduate, we mostly didn't believe it, and it's now one of those completely accepted, proved facts. The Tree of Cousinship, chapter 10, that's about the comparative study of animals and showing by looking at the degree of resemblance between different animals that they fall into a perfect hierarchical tree, a tree of resemblance. And a tree of resemblance, what could that be? What could that mean but a tree of cousinship? It is a family tree. There's no other reasonable explanation for it. Chapter 11, history written all over us. We have within our own bodies our own history. We have the telltale signs of our fishy ancestry in our own bodies. Whales who've gone back to the sea have the telltale signs of their land ancestry, and before that their even more remote fish ancestry. Every creature, if you look at it in sufficient detail, has its history written all over it, written all through the very warp and woof of the body. You can see the history in there. We are all palimpsests of history. Chapter 12, Arms Races. The evolutionary arms race is what accounts for the perfection, the beauty, the elegance of animals. Predators are so good at running, at catching prey. The reason is that prey are so good at running away from predators. And this process, this arms race, has escalated over the millions of years. In separate continents, the escalation in Australia would have been quite independent among the marsupials from the escalation in the Old World, separate from the escalation in South America. But in both cases, when you see an animal which looks as though it's been beautifully designed to do something, like catch prey or run away from predators, to kill, to sense danger. When you see an eye which is so perfectly designed, exactly, not quite perfectly by the way, designed apparently to see and form a real image, precisely focused. This is the end product of an evolutionary arms race. And arms races are a very powerful explainer of why animals and plants are the way they are. Finally, the last chapter, there is grandeur in this view of life. That's a quotation from Darwin, from The Origin of Species, the last paragraph of The Origin of Species. And I did something rather different in that last chapter. I took Darwin's last paragraph, and I took every sentence of Darwin's last paragraph and made that sentence be the section heading, one of my section headings of the last chapter of my book. And so each section of the last chapter is an exposition, an exegesis of that sentence of Darwin's last chapter. And the chairman has told me that I've run out of time, so...
Now we'll move to a period of about 15 minutes, which we've got left, in which you can ask questions and we can have an interaction. So while we're getting that set up, oh, there's somebody there. Okay, fine, cool. Please.
Can I go? Can I ask my question?
Please do.
Professor Dawkins, I'm a great fan of yours, and I just want to link your other work on atheism with what you're talking about today. Creation myths and belief in an afterlife are very stubborn and pervasive across human culture. Do these beliefs, do you think, have any use or utility in human evolutionary terms?
You're absolutely right, of course, that creation myths and myths about supernatural beings are, I would say, ubiquitous, probably universal in human cultures. They vary somewhat. Some are polytheistic, some are monotheistic. You have polytheistic systems like the ancient Greeks and the Norsemen, Hindus today, Roman Catholics today. All those Virgin Marys in different places. But the questioner asks, do they have any utility? Well, utility is an elusive concept because it could mean utility in a Darwinian sense, and that's where my mind, of course, first leaps. Could it be that belief in something supernatural helps or helped our wild ancestors to survive? I rather doubt that in itself, but when we're thinking about Darwinian survival, we have to be a little bit subtle about it. We don't expect that the way we necessarily express it, which is, say, belief in a supernatural, that in itself has survival value, although it might. What we could say is that whatever psychological predisposition leads people under the right cultural conditions to believe in something supernatural, maybe that psychological predisposition or the genetic predisposition to that psychology could have survival value. And it may not be religion itself that has survival value, but something like, say, a tendency to obey tribal elders, to believe what tribal elders tell you, especially if you're a child. And I think it's easy to imagine reasons why children should obey and believe their children, their parents, especially in a country like this where you have. Oh goodness, what happened over there? I don't think the tsunami's arrived, but there's a I think a tree branch has fallen down. There are so many poisonous snakes around, including, I learned from Bill Bryson's book about Australia that I was reading, one called the Eastern Groin Groper. Can that